Okay, so today's lecture, I'm going to talk about what I've described as being dilemmas in international business. We've talked about financial innovations and we've talked about digital innovations. And right at the beginning of the semester, we also talked about the sort of like the notion, the assumption behind innovations, and it was just economic advance. But through our references or our referring to work of some other thinkers, particularly I'm referring to Ulrich Beck here, is that questions have been raised as to and whether or not the innovations are as deterministic as perhaps they are theoretically perceived. In other words, do innovations create the kind of progress that they're assumed to create, or do they actually create in their wake issues? Now, the notions of causality between the innovations and the issues themselves are also somewhat problematic and would need us to think about it and look at the empirical evidence as to suggest where causality is embedded, or where or what the effects of certain actions can have. So towards it, or as we're getting towards the end of the lecture series now and the learning material, so that we can all have a well-earned break before we go back for Christmas. I was going to say, this is going to be the last time I think I speak to you all directly. So I'm just going to take a minute out here just to wish you all a good break and safe travels for when you do move home, or when you get the opportunity to move back home. Yeah, take care of yourselves, all right? I'll say that now because I might not get a chance to tell you all later on. So anyway, I was back to the lecture series and saying that we've got a couple more weeks left together, and I want to address, clearly I want to talk about inequality today, and then on the online materials, learning materials, when I post them, which will probably be tomorrow morning, we'll be addressing issues related to working practices, in that the world of work, as a consequence of our digital innovation, the digital innovations has changed quite dramatically over the years. So that's another dilemma as to what should work look like, or what does work look like currently. Remembering, of course, is that going all the way back to the 1930s and Maynard Keynes's letter to his grandchildren, where he postulated the idea that, you know, his grandchildren, when they became of working age, would only be needed to be working sort of like 15 to 20 hours a week, because the progress that had been made, the profits that would be being made, and the effective distribution of those profits would mean that there would be no need for people to work beyond 20%. We'd be able to live a life of relative leisure. In fact, our primary concern would be, how do we spend our leisure period? Well, that don't happen, does it? I mean, people are working as many hours now as they have done. And in fact, all sorts of social pressures as well have been created, which has extended the working week quite dramatically. And it's not unheard of for people to be working 40 to 60 hours a week every week, and go to work when they're ill, COVID, and not take the holiday to which they have they're either entitled to them. So work is a strange, or the world of work and working practices is a strange beast, and I'll address that in the online learning materials through 2 videos, which I'll post, as I say, tomorrow morning with a bit of luck and a good breeze. Which then leads us to the another issue that I want to talk about, which is, you know, what are firms for? What is the profit-making firm for? Is it just as a measure of ability? Is that it? Or is there actually a wider group of stakeholders that should be seen to be benefiting from the firm itself? And that's really the way I want to explore that, is by looking at what's known as ESG, the environmental sustainability and governance frameworks, and responsible management. And as a consequence of that is by addressing issues related to green financing, or ESG financing, in that companies are making apparent their ESG or CSR, whichever way you want to describe it, their frameworks in order to claim that they are a green corporation. And I want to address that, and we'll do that particularly in our seminars on Thursday and Friday, which has just reminded me. I'll post the materials because it's got the readings and everything in it for the seminars, for those of you who want to prepare for those in advance of Thursday, because Thursday 9 o'clock comes around quite quickly. And then latterly, therefore, for next week, is that I want us to start to think about looking at the morals of this, or the morals of the ethics of everything that we've talked about. Morals and ethics being a philosophical position that addresses issues of whether or is defined as that. So we need to start to think about issues of grey as to how right or how wrong something is. But at least we can start to think about whether or not the frameworks, the ideologies and the theories that we live in order to be able to support our understanding of what business is and what business contributes, just to ask the basic fundamental questions that, are we doing it in the right way? So for the remainder of the semester, we're going to be addressing what I describe as dilemmas in international business. Now, the dilemmas kind of like suggests that there is two sides to it, and of course there's probably more than two facets to this particular series of topics. But if you think about the dilemma, which ultimately we're going to arrive back at the position concerning the moral and ethical, right or wrong, and hence the dilemma that we're talking about. So today we'll talk about inequality, wealth and income inequality in particular. So we look at business and inequality, and specifically distributions of wealth and income within our economy. Okay, so topics that we need to address and think about are things like, how do we measure income inequality? And we'll look at the factors of a production approach. We'll look at also the Gini coefficients. We'll talk about wealth inequality, as that's different from income inequality. And then we'll talk about income and wealth inequality as it matters for business in terms of GDP growth, but also start to look towards political consequences, which I'll probably address more fully in next week's materials relating to ethics and morals. And also look at the work of Thomas Piketty, a well-known scholar in this particular area, who's written two very substantial pieces of work, Capital in the 21st Century and also Capital and Ideology, which I've listed as being a reading on the reading lists online, just the introductory chapter. And I think the introductory chapter is very informative and is worth considering, I think, for anybody that's undertaking study into business and thinking about a career in business once they leave university. But Piketty, in his more recent work, which is Capital and Ideology, suggests that inequality is actually a political choice. What questions need to be raised there is that, but why on earth would somebody think, or would a political elite or a political grouping consider that inequality is an acceptable thing that occurs in the 21st century? And one of the areas that perhaps I don't address in this topic, but I think maybe I will do in next week's materials, is that there is also inequality in opportunity. You know, our society is by and large addressed as being a meritocracy, and what you get is as a consequence of your work and your brain power and so on and so forth. But how much of it is actually down to the position that we hold when we're born? For the most part, is that you'll earn incomes not dissimilar to your parents' incomes. For the most part, is that you have had a high degree of opportunity in order to be able to accelerate your school careers and end up in a university. We are, if you like, all accidents of birth. But that's not quite the case for everybody, is that a number of people have less opportunity than we do, one that we have enjoyed. Now, I'm not blaming anybody for that. That's just a fact of life. But is that something that we need to address as we think about income inequality and wealth inequality, which is perhaps correlated to actually inequality and opportunity in the first instance? So let's address those first topics, which is about measuring income. And we've talked about GDP in the past, and this is one of the ways in which you can measure GDP: consumption plus investment plus government purchases, and then any net off the foreign expenditure that we might gain from imports against exports. But there's an alternative way, which is looking at income as opposed to the value of productive goods and services. And by and large, income should correlate with productive goods and services. They do mostly, but you can see at the bottom of this, there's a statistical adjustment that's added to it in order to make sure that they do actually, that actually the two totals are the same. But the income approach is based upon wages, rents, interest payments, and profits. Now, rents are the kind of literally the rents that are payable through non-earned income. So we're earning money through productive work, but we're also earning money through rents, i.e. non-productive work. Now, one way in which we can do this is that by renting a property to somebody. That is an income that is derived, say, if I rent it to me, but the classification is as a rent. We know that, that's quite straightforward. But similarly, if I was to earn money through share ownership, as an example, and I would gain on my shares or as a dividends, that's still classed as being rents. And by and large, people that earn money from rents are referred to as rentiers, i.e. they're earning money through not doing any productive work. And again, is that a right thing or a wrong thing? It brings into question the moral positions that we're taking. As an example, a Marxist scholar by the name of Bukharin suggested that actually rentiers were parasitic consumers, which is rather strong, isn't it, if you think about it? And what he's suggesting is that rentiers enjoy income, but they don't do any productive work to actually create the income. And they spend all of that income on conspicuous consumption, buying goods and so on and so forth that the majority of people would not be able to buy because of their accelerated or their higher levels of earnings. So that's what a rent is, and interests and profits you'd be well aware of. So there are two different approaches, but they equate to the same number. So when you look at income, is that the largest share of income goes to the compensation of employees, which is in wages and salaries and any other kind of payments that might be made, such as national insurance contributions or pension payments and so on and so forth. But a considerable chunk, i.e. rents and interest, proprietors' incomes, corporate profits, go towards capital owners, not the labour, which are the workers. It goes towards capital, which tend to be the owners of the means of production. And then there's a third element, which is the smallest element, and that's taxes on production and imports that go towards the state and derive state income. But they're just a bundle of the different ways in which income is derived through it in a national economy. What's interesting is that where you look at where the income is flowing, and this is taken from a book by Thomas Pally called Financialization, and back in 2014 is that he did the work looking at where flows of income flowed through the economy and which was growing and which was declining. Now, what Pally's done is he's looked at the way the flows of income and the growth areas and the declining areas, which is shown by the pluses and the minuses. Okay, so where there's a minus, there's a decline in income, and where there's a plus, there's a growth in income. So income, or gross domestic product, remember it's the same thing, starts at the top and it flows down through our economy. But labour share, the amount that's going towards wages and salaries, earned income, in other words, is decreasing as a proportion of total income. But when you follow that down into the next level down, is that the amount that management or the managers of firms are earning is growing to the detriment of the non-managerial share of income. So earned income is declining, but the management, particularly senior management I'm referring to here, are gaining a higher share to the detriment of the money that's earned by the workforce. Okay, so if we look across to the other side of the chart now, is that the amount that's going in towards capital, the capital share of interest and profits, is increasing. Interest payments in particular are increasing, and in that we would class also dividend payments. Okay, profits are declining as a proportion. They're growing in aggregate, but they are declining as a proportion of national income. But the amount that's being paid into dividend payments is increasing. Now, we've talked about that in the past, although we've not drawn about the implications. And the reason for that would be is that cash flow that is derived from the business itself, the free cash flow, can only be invested in a number of or utilized in a number of different ways. It can either be paid back to shareholders in the form of shareholder value, or it can be invested in the business, or it can be saved. Now, depending on whom the shareholders are, they probably don't like the idea of their money being saved, and so will put pressure upon management in order to actually increase interest payments. But the net result of that is a short-termist kind of perspective, and the amount of money that's being invested into the business, the productive value of the business, declining over time. And the profits, in terms of like who's making the profits are actually being made, or there's a higher proportion of profits being made in the financial sector. So if you are a shareholding manager within the financial sector, is that you will be taking more than the lion's share of the distribution of national income over a period of time. And I would also add in tech businesses in that as well now. But that just shows you the way that national income is being distributed. Okay, one side is there's an increase in it to the detriment of the other side. Is that national income is a fixed amount; it can only go one way or the other. And as an example of that, is that this chart shows that the gap between executive pay and the average wages has widened in the US. Now, it's widened also in other countries, including the developed world, but not to the extent that we're seeing in the US. And we've given reasons as to why we address the US in particular in the past as well. But I think that what's interesting here, when you look at the compensation ratio between CEOs and workers, is that there's two lines on the graph. There's the light blue line, and then there's the dark blue line. Well, the light blue line is showing the ratio based on options granted. So this is the proportion increase from CEO income to average workers' income, which is promised by contract, i.e. it's granted. And that's 220% or 221% more than average workers. Whereas if what you do is that you consider, sorry, it's 220 times, I think, isn't it? Yes, it's a ratio. It's 220 times the more than average workers. But when you consider the amount of options realized, so this is not what's guaranteed by contract, this is what is actually awarded to them in real terms, is higher than that. It's actually over 300 times more than average worker income. But what's interesting is the graph, the sort of the actual line of the graph and its trajectory, is that you see from the 1980s onwards, which we've defined as being the financialization era, is that there's a dramatic shift in earning power of senior management, CEOs. The curve is like a hockey stick, and it settles out at around about 2000 and declines as a consequence of global financial crisis, but not down to the kind of levels that we've seen in the past. Chief executive pay as a multiple of average worker pay is still very, very high, which of course contributes to the notions of inequality. Let's consider what's known as the Gini coefficient then. And there's some interesting observations that we can make about the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient, broadly speaking, suggests that it's a measure between 1 and 0. Okay, so if the Gini coefficient is 1, then that means that one person within that economy holds all the money, all the income. If it's 0, it means that it's equally distributed and everybody gains an equal share of the income. Now, the curves that you can see from this piece of work, or the number of different works, show that the Gini coefficient from 2005 onwards has been going down, which means that the income distribution is more equal. And that's the case, that's what we've seen. But this is between countries, okay? It's not within the country itself, it's distributed between countries. And almost exclusively, this is as a consequence of the rise of China and the increases in income levels that we've seen in China. So substantial is it, sort of the 500 million people that have joined the middle classes in China, that it's had an impact upon the global distribution of income. So income distribution in between between countries has got more equal over time. When you look at the global the distribution of income within the country, however, that's not quite the case. Okay, so let's look at these graphs here. And this is GDP per capita growth and income inequality as expressed by the Gini coefficient, or the Gini index, from 1970 to 2018. The graph on the left shows income inequality in high income countries, the advanced economies. And what we can see here is that income inequality is increased by both measures, from GDP per capita, which is slowing down, and also the Gini coefficient is increasing. So the income distribution in high income countries is becoming more and more polarized. In emerging economies, which is the graph which is in the middle, the red one, is that income inequality is decreasing, but that decrease has been deteriorating since 2013. In other words, is that the trend of inequality decreasing has slowed down, and income distribution is now becoming more unequal. And then the final one, which is in low income countries, is that income inequality is decreasing. And the income inequality between the 1980s and 2013 has decreased, i.e. it's become fairer, but like the emerging economies, as income inequality is increasing since 2013 onwards. So across the globe, therefore, is that we're seeing a position whereby income inequality is by and large increasing across the whole world within countries. Now, this is a graph taken from Thomas Piketty's work, Capital in the 21st Century. And his book is, it's a bit dull actually, and it's just mainly a statistical analysis of income and history, income figures, inequality figures, and historical data. But what is interesting, I think, is the path of the income distribution, in that Piketty's work is in a massive historical tome. It's a magnum opus in that respect. And what Piketty does, he doesn't just look at these Anglo-Saxon countries, he looks at a number of different countries across the globe, actually. I know you've just lost your screen. I just want to see if I can format this a bit better. Don't think it's going to allow me to do it. No, that's as good as it's going to get. Oh well, that's the way it's going to. That's the way it's going to be. So, Let me go back to sharing this with you again. Is that if you look at income inequality of these Anglo-Saxon countries, the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, back in 2010, we saw very, very high levels of income inequality. And the path from 1910 onwards is for it to decline. Now, there are reasons for this in terms of greater democracy and voting power, a wider workforce in the cities, demanding a say in the way that things were run. So, you know, you've got wider enfranchisement of the vote, basically, at this time. There's also quite an increase in some radical politics that's occurring, particularly in Europe at this time. And owners of capital are worried. And so they grant rights and employment protections to the workforce, make it safer, cleaner, pay better wages. And as a consequence of that is that income inequality decreases. But it really starts to kick in after the Second World War. There's quite a dramatic decline if you just look at the quite a dramatic decline there as a consequence of the end of the Second World War. General populations have suffered quite a lot of hardship and are demanding that their politicians provide them with a more stable, more secure, and a better lifestyle. What did we fight for? Might be a legitimate question. And as a consequence of that, over a period of time, is that inequality declines quite dramatically. Yeah. Now, this also coincides with something that occurred in 1944, which is known as Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods hearings. And the Bretton Woods hearings, which the largest economies on the planet met at a place called Bretton Woods, not surprisingly, in the States, in order to try and structure global finance so that, I mean, it was really set up to answer problems that came out of the Great Depression of the 1920s and the 1930s. But obviously, it was put back because the Second World War happened. But by 1944, it was considered relatively safe to consider the topics that were going to be addressed prior to the Second World War. And during this, well, as a consequence of Bretton Woods, out of which my hero, Keynes, played a considerable role, is that finance was regulated. Global finance was regulated. Once finance was regulated, then we see that inequality declines across the globe. In fact, this is a period that's referred to as the golden age of economy, in that we see rapid growth, but also growing equality of incomes across the globe. And I haven't got the figures here in a graph for the developing world, but if you look at the developing world maps the curves that I'm showing you here just a bit later on. Okay, so we have this global era of peace and growth, prosperity, which is being shared. And then as regulations are rolled back as a consequence of the financialization era, is that global inequality goes up again, to the point where we're experiencing inequality levels as we saw back in the early 20th century in the Edwardian era, which is quite dramatic and quite telling, and really, depending upon your viewpoint, is a failure of global economics, and by association, I would argue as well, global business. So Piketty presents this picture of increasing inequality across the globe. Now, perhaps we might not, or perhaps we ought to address the issues of cause and effect here, because Piketty gives us a reason as to why this is occurring. And it gives it as the identity, which is R is greater than G. Now, let me go back to the first slide, which has got that down there, is that you can see it there, look. Halfway down the page, it says Piketty 2014, R is greater than G. What this simply means is that the return on financial investments is greater than GDP growth. And where you have the position where R is returning more than G, not surprisingly, where is the investment going to go? And as economy slows, more and more money is being invested in financial investments as opposed to in productive capacity, which is processes that we've talked about on a number of different occasions throughout the lecture series. So Piketty's reason for increasing inequality is because more money is being invested into financial investments. But the important thing here to note is that who is making the investments? Well, the people that are going to make the investments are Bukharin's rentiers, the parasitic consumers, which is inflammatory, I know, but they're rentiers nonetheless, is that that's how they make their money. They're making their money out of investment and speculation, not investing into productive capacity. And who are those people? Well, they are clearly the most wealthy members of our own societies, because they are the ones that have got the additional income that they can invest. Somebody at the poorer end of the income spectrum is not going to have money to be able to invest. For the most part, they're living check by check to check to check to check, paycheck to paycheck. Statistics show us that an average American cannot afford an additional bill of about $250 without actually taking on debt in order to be able to pay it, which broadly speaking means if your washing machine, your fridge or your television goes, the only way you can replace it is by borrowing money in order to be able to buy it. Is that there's not enough money between income earned, wages, and our outgoings. There's not enough disposable income in order to be able to account for it, which is quite dramatic. And that is Piketty's reasoning behind increasing levels of income inequality. His solution to it is tax, wholesale tax and distribution of wealth, which of course has attracted quite a lot of criticism as well, you can imagine. And to support Piketty's view is that nominal financial wealth, i.e. wealth that's gained through investment, has gone up much more than productive wealth, money that's been invested in productive capacity since the financialization era. And you can see that there's a split in the red to the blue curve. The red is financial wealth and the blue one is productive wealth. So let's look at wealth as a separate issue. Now, I've got a number of different charts like this over a period of time, and I can tell you that the population that are enjoying the majority of the income at the top is getting smaller by number, but the amount that they actually have in terms of wealth that they hold is getting bigger. So in this particular chart, 42 million people, which is 0.8% of the population, have got wealth which is in excess of $1 million. That means that 1 out of every 100 people have got wealth which is in excess of $1 million. That doesn't sound, it sounds odd, doesn't it? Is that how many of them we got on this screen here? 67 of us. So there's 67 of us, so there's 2/3 of an individual that's out there that's got wealth that's more than $1 million in the population. But the amount that actually of wealth that they're holding is $142 trillion, which is 45% of global wealth. 1% of the population are holding 45% of global wealth. And actually, if you break those numbers down, it's actually 1% of 1% that's holding the considerable proportion of all of that wealth. 92% of stocks in the US are held by 10% of the population. So that's interesting at that end. $1 million of wealth, well, broadly speaking, if you've got a big house and you've paid it all off, you're about there. And, you know, the majority of you or the majority of your parents, probably your grandparents, may well be sitting in that $1 million bracket, or not far away from it anyway. What's interesting is at the other end of the spectrum, where the bulk of the people live. which is the blue figure, the royal blue figure at the bottom, where 3.2 billion people, 63% of the global population, have got wealth less than $10,000, which is 2%. 2% of global wealth is held by 64% of the population. So income is unequally distributed, but wealth is even more so. And again, the rationale for this is because the amount of money that can be earned through investment is higher than the amount of money that can be earned through productive growth. Particularly if you're a worker and you're being paid out of the profits of the firm, or expecting to see productivity gains as the firms become more productive. So the argument goes is that actually labour gains from the productive, or labour earns more as a consequence of productive gain. Well, that's not the case quite so much anymore, in that there is a split in productive gains and median incomes, in that productive gains are not being passed on. They're being put into free cash flow, paid in income in terms of interest payments and rents, and the rentiers of our society are able to invest in financial investments, which helps increase their wealth. So we've got a very dramatic current occurring in our contemporary economy at the moment. There's a bit of a boring graph for you, and all it shows you is the top 1%, which is the grey line at the bottom, of the real beneficiaries of increases in wealth as a share of financial assets. 1% of the population, of the global population, are beneficiaries, irrespective of where they are. Conjunctural bubbles in a financialized economy. Yes, we're back to that word conjuncture again. So it's just the context, the co-joining of different variables at any one particular point in time, which is expressed in the financial cycle. Despite financial crisis, the global stock markets have rewarded owners of financial assets, particularly after the 2007 crisis. Quantitative easing by the central banks have rewarded owners of financial assets by making liquidity available, making access to money available so that people can borrow the money in order to actually invest in financial assets and increase their own wealth holdings. And I think that what's interesting here is that where you look at the MSI, which is the black line, the black solid line, and that's the index of stock markets, is that stock markets have grown considerably, which means that the number of billionaires has grown also. So these columns show number of billionaires. Stock markets are given by the, oh, look, that's clever. Blew it. Are given by the dark line, the black line. So 2007, number of billionaires drops. But by 2010, the amount of billionaires have recovered. And now we've got more billionaires on the planet than ever. That's not necessarily a bad thing, is it? Providing that you are one of the billionaires. And my guess is that your aspiration is that you'd like to be one of those. And I've got no problem with that whatsoever. I think that what we're considering here is a dilemma in international business, as whether or not actually creating billionaires is what the economy is designed to do, or whether or not the economy is designed to actually promote a sense of equality so that all of the members of society gain as a consequence of economic output and economic wealth. And that, as we've seen as a consequence of the figures that I've shown you and the charts that I've shown you, is not happening, in that we've got this polarization of wealth and income between the richer people on one hand and the poorer people on the other hand. Not everybody is gaining as much, or not everybody gains at the same rate. And when you look at the household wealth of various household wealth of households, then genius. When you look at household wealth broken down by the quintiles, and then latterly towards the end of it, in terms of the top 10% and the top 1%, which is averaged out against OECD countries, is that the top 1% hold the bulk of over half of their wealth as being financial assets. Yes, they've got a lot of non-financial assets as well because they can buy more stuff. So they've got non-financial assets as well, but they're doubling their wealth holdings through financial assets. And as you go down through the quintiles, that falls off dramatically, in that the top 10% have lesser of an income or lesser wealth is actually in financial assets than it is in non-financial assets, and it goes down. So that's the top 10%. So the top 1% of our economies really is driving the bulk of financial investments and are benefiting from it in increased wealth and increased rents. And that brings to a conclusion the first part of these materials. See you all later.